Nagesh. Can you hear me, Nagesh?
Yep. Can you hear me? Cool. Let's make coffee. I have to drop off at 1 o'clock. Just FYI. There's a meeting that I couldn't change around. Justin, did you see my tree? I think you're on mute. I think you're on mute.
There's mine. I also I got a lot of joy from the Amazon sockets this year.
Yeah.
So I have it all, like I have it set, and then you tell who, because she'll hear me and start doing the thing. And it turns it on, turns it off. It's probably
Like your
joy.
own personal lighting ceremony, right?
Yeah.
That's what I call it.
I see Akeem and Susanna. Great. I put the deck that I sent around yesterday as the agenda skeleton in the handouts box for everyone's reference, including the people that are here just as spectators, just the other attendees too. So you can find that in the handouts box. Let's see Rebecca. Let me bring her in. Hey, Rebecca.
Hey, Justin, how are you?
Good. I think we're waiting on Aaron and Jen and Sam.
Is this meeting public or no?
Yes, it's public. Okay. Everything public.
Yeah, I don't see anybody else that's on this one.
Hey, Aaron, and then there's Sam, make panelist. And then I'm still waiting on Jen. So everybody that's on the selection committee should be in panelist mode and can talk and show their camera and everything. And then, okay, there's Sam. And then Jen, just waiting on Jen. I will get her. Jen is on her way. Once again, I put the deck that I sent out yesterday to the selection committee in the Dropbox. There's not very much in it, it's pretty lean, but you can reference that as we go along if you're looking for an agenda. Jen is, I think Jen just joined. Great. All right. We will go ahead and call our 5th meeting of the DCRPP selection committee to order. Just as an update, last week we had 2 presentations from our finalist applicants, one from George Washington University, the other from the Urban Institute. The selection committee was able to hear a short 15-minute overview presentation, and then we opened up the floor for questions and answers for the remaining period of time. Today, we are meeting to synthesize what we heard in those presentations and also in the supplemental material. So we're going to give every selection committee member the opportunity to sort of express what they learned through that process, what they're thinking through that process, any thoughts on supplemental. I think I wrote in the handout 5 minutes for everyone just sort of, articulate their thoughts to the group. And then we will proceed to thinking about how our next steps. So let's first start. I see everyone here. Is there anyone that wants to volunteer to go first, or I can call somebody? So to do sort of their 5 minutes, sort of pro cons of what they heard and what they're thinking to open up our discussion.
I can go first if no one else volunteers.
Who is that, Rebecca?
Susanna.
Oh, Susanna, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah. Hi. So thank you so much for convening us and for getting, for everyone's thoughts on our panelists, on our 2 applications last week. I thought that our conversation prior to that meeting, their follow-up responses, and the actual session with the 2 applicants really changed my opinion about the relative merits of the 2 applications. So I think we're in a very good place that we have 2 extremely strong applications. I think that I was just really impressed by GW's emphasis on collaboration and a relationship-driven approach to this research. I think an RPP is very different than other types of research in that it's more action-oriented. So we're looking for results in terms of improving student outcomes and instruction in the district. And it's not as purely of a research focus as like most academic research projects would be. So I really appreciated the humility that they brought to their proposal and their emphasis on listening closely to the stakeholders and engaging the advisory committee at every step in the process. And I liked seeing also their working dynamic during the presentation. It seemed like they had regular meetings and have been working together for an extended period of time, and they presented a coherent narrative. And I really like the phrase that they kept emphasizing, which was they didn't want to be lobbing their research over a wall, that they wanted that just putting out research isn't enough if it's not being listened to and it's not heard and it's not meaningful to the the receiving party. So I thought like Urban Institute had a very strong technical proposal, but I was sort of turned off by their emphasis on independence above and all other qualities, which I think is not the best attribute for an RPP. I think it's one element of it, but I'd like more the collaborative approach. Their presentation seemed a little bit disjointed. So we had the main presentation from Urban, but then the partner organizations presented their own research, but I didn't really understand how it fit together and how it fit with the RPP in particular. Like I learned a lot from their presentation, but I didn't find that it tied back necessarily to the RPP as strongly as it could have. And also I appreciated that GW wants DC government to have skin in the game and doesn't see that the district's contribution is a downside, whereas Urban does. And I think that if this is going to be meaningful engagement, they should be responsive to elected officials and to district residents, and soliciting funds from the district government would help promote that. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Susanna. Any other next volunteer, or I can draft someone.
I'm happy to go to. So I think kind of echoing what Susanna said, but I want to start first again with my long time ago now comment that I do, given that we have two good applicants, both with pros and cons, I do think this is still kind of silly of the district to not ask them to partner together. We're not awarding a contract. We are not giving them any money. I just don't see why we wouldn't ask them to come and work together, and both organizations express interest in working together. You would be able to leverage both skill sets in a real way, whereas having one be quote unquote awarded and then working with the other later just doesn't do that. You're not asking them to come together in advance, and it's not the same thing. So I still think that would be the smartest bet, bang for the buck for the district. Yeah, for many reasons. Funding as well, just like the whole scope of things. I don't think this makes a lot of sense. That said, if I have to make a pitch for one proposal over the other, it would definitely be GW for a lot of the same reasons that Susanna mentioned. The first is that they seem to really understand that RPP work is fundamentally different than other research. It just is, and they really get that. And that shows, it shines through in a bunch of different ways in their application, their supplementary materials, and in their presentation. One of the ways that it's evidenced, I think, is that they have a much better understanding of the type of work and products and methods that an RPP typically uses. The most work that RPPs produce is descriptive. It's not impact studies. Those are great, and honestly, like typically make up the small piece of an RPP that happens after it gets going a little bit more, and the jurisdiction is more comfortable with their research partner. Like Chicago didn't do the closing schools study right away. No, that happens later. And so Urban, is more focused on that type of work, and it just is not a good reflection of the type of work that RPPs do and why it's different. And I also think that this shows up in GW's knowledge of best practices in RPPs, in particular in their discussion of how they will take in, clean or not, and make available data to the other researchers in the partnership. RPPs have learned over the past 10 to 20 years that the researchers using the data at this point really need to see the raw data with documented problems. Otherwise, they will make misleading conclusions and poor interpretations of the data. People who know the data better and know all the problems, which all data has problems, do better research. So folks have learned at this point that you don't want to hand over data that has been cleaned. You want your researchers to know what they're talking about. And so, I had a concern in Urban's presentation that they didn't really understand that, and they were planning on, cleaning some of the data before sharing it with researchers. And this would lead to a risk of misleading conclusions and incorrect interpretations. And then the last point, I think, kind of building on that, is that in some GW's partnership and coalition of folks they brought together does represent the most neutral positioning, and the in the research ecosystem. The thing about RPPs is that if it's going to be successful, how research and evidence gets used is based on relationships and trust. It doesn't matter how cool it is. If people don't trust it, it's not going to make a difference. And there is a real difference between work that comes out of AIR, Policy Studies Associates, GW, and a think tank or multiple think tanks. There just is. As one example, I know AIR has, this is why they're too expensive in some cases, but they have a process of 3 independent analysts redoing code themselves before something comes out, is produced in a project, and it's that's something that you won't see from a think tank. So the process of generating research and how it's perceived on the outside is different, and so that is, I've worked in both settings, in think tanks and in research organizations, and the business model for non-think tank work is really different, and heavily relies on your neutrality and objectivity and all of the processes and protocols you put in place to ensure that. Otherwise, they don't get work. So that on the whole, their application just represents the most neutral and rigorous research portfolio that I think an RPP requires to build that trust.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. Next, any volunteers?
I don't mind jumping in. Oh, go ahead,
Go
Sam.
ahead, Rebecca.
Mine's going to be, I think, fairly shorter, but I don't disagree with the things that Susanna and Erin pointed out. I will say, though, I was actually, I think, moved the other direction. I came into the presentations like slightly favoring GW, but in listening to their answers, for me, like, I don't disagree that GW seemed more collaborative. I think they have skin in the game too, right? Like being in DC, but when hearing them talk about how they executed, I was not
Rebecca,
confident that they could actually do the things that they were saying they would do. Even the question, oh no, Okay, why doesn't Sam go and then I'll plug in, I'll hardwire into my network and go next. Can you hear that? Like Sam go and I have a.
I think if you can, yeah. So yeah, I'll go ahead. I think what my first point is an overarching one, which I think is a process one, which is that in any selection process, whether it's a grant review or a hiring process, I think it's important to focus on the totality of the scoring, in that we have reviewed these in 3 stages now, and there's a human tendency to think about the last thing you heard, as opposed to the body of the work that people have submitted. So I would just encourage all of us to think about how we scored each part of it, and not and kind of resist that tendency to think about kind of what happened in an interview, which is probably the most kind of open to our own biases and different things. The takeaways that I had is I came into it with specific questions that I wanted answered, although understanding that both of them had strong applications. And for me, the area where GW had stood out more than Urban in the past was on their security and data sharing protocol. But in their response to it, that they had a good plan, but they had never within the partners implemented that plan. That kind of not eliminated that advantage, but downgraded it a little bit, and put them, based on Urban's response, closer together, because they were in kind of not exactly the same territory, but where Urban was like, we can do that. We have not, but we can do that in terms of their archive infrastructure. A little bit closer together. I think that I was also more satisfied with Urban's responses on pre-registration and pre-specification. I think I take a different view than what GW submitted and their response, in that I think when you're doing things that involve a lot of data cleaning, a lot of descriptive work and definition of variables, it's just as important to make sure that you're transparent and open about what you are trying to find, rather than kind of saying that sort of thing is just for causal analyses. I just have a difference of opinion on that, and so was kind of more satisfied with Urban's response in those things. And also more satisfied with their response to my question on kind of what high quality work is and what rigorous work is. And so in my mind, I think it's important to, again, look at the totality of the application materials, but for the specific questions that I was looking for clarification on, based on those materials, I emerged from it more satisfied with Urban's responses to those things than I was for GW on it. And if anyone wants me to wax more about pre-specification and open science, I'm happy to in the remaining 90 seconds that I have. But I do feel like that's an area where, even if it hasn't been traditionally done, I think it's really important for the independence of the work, and we found it to be tremendously useful in our work, regardless of what the research activity is, whether it's purely descriptive or it's a causal analysis. And so those were kind of where I moved a little bit from it, but also, again, would say we should look at the entirety of the materials. We already scored people in different ways, and this just adds a little bit more information rather than overwriting everything that the applicants have submitted thus far, in my mind. Oh, actually, so since I think have a couple of minutes, I also thought that what was in the materials that Urban submitted on their QA/QC process was more consistent with best practices in reanalysis and quality control than what I saw in GWs. And so I was also heartened by their commitment, and they put it on record then in the interview that those procedures would be applied to their partners as well, that it would be common procedures across them. And so those were the things that I heard that were, I guess, different from what my standing to begin the interviews.
Thanks, Sam. Rebecca?
Yeah, hi. Okay, I think this should be better now, but let me know if it's not. Yeah, I agree with all of the assessments. I think for me, I was leaning a little towards GW coming into this. It was very close, but I think when the questions I had things about for GW about their what looks like a very aggressive timeline, like what I would even think impossible to do. So I asked questions about that, and the responses I think weren't as satisfying as I would like them to be. I think Elizabeth's response was something to the effect of, yeah, the team had concerns too, but I decided to just go with it anyway. It gave me concerns about the ability to actually do the things that they said they were going to do. I do agree that the partnership with them would be strong. I like their approach to the collaboration, but at the end of the day, I had more confidence that Urban would actually be able to execute and do the things we wanted them to do. And it felt like the concerns that you all brought up about them are real. Even the way that the presentations were shared with us, GW is clearly like formatted for consumption in a better way, right? But I feel like the gaps, they're both very strong and they both have their own weaknesses, but at the end of the day, it felt like it would be easier to overcome those with Urban than it would be with GW. I still wasn't quite satisfied with the response about hiring 2 full-time researchers on on a project that they also said they wanted to be agile and be able to move. So I still had questions about that. But yeah, I mean, it's still very close. I think they're both very strong, but at the end of that, I'm leaning more towards Urban.
Thanks, Rebecca. Akeem or Jen?
Yeah, I'll go. I think, well, if there was a vote, then it doesn't sound like we'd meet the legislative requirement. There are 2 council votes for GW and 1 mayoral vote and a maybe for Urban. And I'm not going to help that situation out either because I'm leaning Urban. Going into this, I had Urban slightly higher than GW. And I'm still at that place. To Sam's point earlier, I would say that the 2 biggest things for me going in was how are they going to work together in terms of the partnership. But then the other piece was is whatever they produce going to be useful to practitioners? So like, how are they going to use this information to change practice? And Susanna brought up a quote that I wrote down from GW where they talked about lobbing research over the wall. I never got the sense that based on their response that research would be useful to practitioners. And that was the thing that was most concerning to me. And then the other piece, when we talked about the budget and their request for funding from the city, based on their supplemental responses and their responses last week, I do have concerns about their ability to get it off the ground without funding from the city. And that I know we had spoken previously that shouldn't be, we don't want to ding someone for having that, for having in their piece a request for funding from the city. But I that's something that's in the back of my head. And so like because of that, like I still land on the place where I don't know that GW is the right one, so I'm still leaning more towards urban.
All right, I think I'm the last one. I think, Akeem, you and I are a little bit no-mindy. I also, when I scored the first time around, can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. When I scored the first time around, I had them even. I think to everyone's points thus far, we have two very strong proposals, so we're very fortunate. And I really appreciated them coming on to both speak and answer all of our questions, and we covered a lot of ground. I think my largest concern with urban was the coordination across so many partners, and also understanding on how that would all work. I felt like their responses actually gave me more confidence that urban is the one that in the end is the quarterback, essentially, for figuring out and making it all operate, and the commitment to move forward with their own funding and backing of the information. I think I, like Sam, also felt very confident in their QC and QA of the data. I think I interpreted their answer a little bit different from Aaron in that I think their point was to turn over raw data to have a partner reassess the quality of the data, and thus and so forth could cause more error than them taking the responsibility of making sure to understand the data fully, document it, and to share the concerns with any data with their partners. So that's how I interpreted what they said. That's what I understood them to say. So actually that gave me quite a bit of confidence on how they would manage this very large data management process, which is key, right, to being so efficient and fast and responsive to the advisory committee and assisting learning at the schools. I think, like Akeem, I was very concerned with the answer from GW, both in their original proposal and in their supplementals, that they do need additional dollars, that they do recognize with the pandemic and our revenue challenges that would be a hard ask. And I believe Dr. Foyer's comment was the district needs to have skin in the game. And I also believe that the district has shown the amount of skin in the game, particularly with the amount of data and collaborations it's going to take to go forward. So it concerns me if GW really does need the dollars, that they are going to be hamstrung being able to move forward, and that concerns me with awarding it to them. And I think some of the last piece was around the collaboration and trust. Agreed, and 100% agree that these are not academic papers that should be coming out. These need to be fast, timely, accurate, and responsive. And I actually found that the panelists on the urban team demonstrated research that they had done in the last 3-6 months to do that in order to be responsive and quick, to show both the impact of learning loss and to share that back with the individual LEAs to see where there are challenges. I think that was one. And then with the, I think from the policies, DC Policy Center study on the preference, I believe they also worked with those LEAs to show how it would impact should they have their preference, that at-risk preference implemented. So again, I completely agree that these are not academic pieces, but they need to be rigorous, they need to be accurate, and they need to be responsive. And I felt confident in Urban's responses in being able to do that. So I don't know how long I've gone on, but I'll stop there.
All right.
Thank
you everyone for, oh, hold on just one second. Sam, were you saying something?
I just had a, I guess, a process or bureaucracy or legislative question about the funding part of it, but I'm guessing it's for you, Justin or Nagesh, but I don't know when to ask it. So just let me know if there's a time to ask it.
I think let's go ahead and ask that question, because I think Nagesh and I wanted to sort of give our thoughts on another related issue, and then I think Akeem can also speak a little bit to legislative intent here too, and we'll do our best to answer some of these questions. But yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so I just didn't, and this is just what I don't know. Like, I know the budgeting side of things, and I know like the local Anti-Deficiency Act in terms of obligating things. I know that this is different in that it's a grant agreement, but like, are there things that we should be considering in terms of GW and Urban's proposal as it relates to district funding in terms of awarding it, or like, is it like if GW has said we will seek, I guess I don't know that they've said that they require district funding, but if they said that in order to make their model work, it would require district funding, is there something that would need to be put into the agreement with them if they were awarded, or is there something that would need to reference or respond to the explicit legislation if we were to do that? I'm just kind of curious, like how we should think of that, at least request or intent to seek further funding as we make our decisions.
Can I clarify though?
Yeah.
My interpretation was that they were being honest about the staff side of skin in the game. There is not a single RPP that doesn't require, you know, SEA or LEA, depending on the partnership, staff time. And so they were acknowledging that that costs money for on the district side, not asking the district to put dollars in this first year, and then said in the next year they would you know, be interested in continuing those conversations about funding with the district. But in the first year, they were recognizing staff time, which they both will need, you know, a lot of. So that was my, you know, even though Urban didn't say that, that's just a fact. That's not something that differs by the two of them.
So
can I ask a clarifying question real quick? So Erin, then for second year with GW, would they then reassess whether or not they need to ask for money then?
That's what it sounded like, is that they would, you know, continue to have an open pathway to conversations about district funding, but their model wasn't resting on, you know, folks asked GW a lot of budget questions that we didn't ask of Urban. So I think there's a little bit of different sets of information here, but it was, to me, what they said was they were, you know, were interested in continuing to have those conversations, but they didn't say that they required district money to continue the partnership. And yeah, I guess the other thing is, like, in RPP circles, folks think that the district does not want an RPP. Okay, so like there's just quote unquote handing over the data. One hasn't happened yet, which is fine. There's no partner yet. But this has been a quite protracted process and a legislative process, which is fine. That's what the district did and how we invested in this. But from the research partner and funder side, you know, a lot of people think that the district doesn't want a research partnership. So that, you know, I think talking honestly about that and saying one way to show that, you know, that we really do, we really actually do. We know it was a long process. We know it was a tough time getting here, but we actually really are invested in this, is with funding. That is one way to do that.
So I just want to be clear, Erin, is that the reason that I think I'm the person that asked the budget questions was that GW had it as a line item in their budget over multiple years, right? So that is why there are budget questions to GW on this. And you are right, Urban made it clear in their proposal that they were not asking for district funding, which is why GW got those questions. I just want to make that very clear.
So if I may, I want to just get to sort of the substantive question, and then you all, it sounds like you're having a conversation regarding the, I want to get to sort of a procedural question that Sam asked, and then you can go back and talk about the substance of the application. So Sam, regarding this, and feel free Nagesh and also Akeem, based on your and anybody's understanding of the law, but we were asked to write a notice of invitation. The law was very descriptive about the timeline and writing a notice of invitation. So if you go to the underlying statute 38785.03 and you look at this statute, it will talk about what the notice at a minimum has to require. And in C2 and C3, it said that they had to provide an estimate of the initial startup cost to establish the partnership and the annual cost needed to operate the partnership. And then 3 was identification of potential sources of funding, including funds contributed by the applicant entity, funds anticipated from named private sources, and funds, if any, needed from the district for the initial startup costs and annual operations of the partnership. So we included language in the NOI that spoke to that. The law did not provide any parameters around saying, okay, this, like if one person says yes or one person says no, it didn't tell us which one was better than or not. It was up to the selection committee to make a selection. We also know that like funds have to be appropriated, and no funds at this time have been appropriated based on the authorization of the DC of the Research Practice Partnership.
We have previously appropriated dollars for the RPP. It just that wasn't awarded in the beginning of FY21. The council has approved those dollars, but I think those were one-time.
For the auditor's office, correct?
Those were one-time dollars that went to the auditor's office.
To the auditor's office.
For the data audit that I believe they are working on right now.
It's complete. We've received agency comment and had all our closeout meetings and everything. So that will be published in about a month.
I just want to say that within the context of the district's $16 billion budget, coming up with a few $100,000 to contribute to this project should not be too hard of a lift, even within the context of a very tight budget year. So as someone who's worked intimately in the budget process for 5 years, I can say that a few $100,000 should not be the deciding factor in terms of which proposal to award.
And legislatively, I wanted to add that I asked our general counsel about the panel's recommendation and if it would require any amendment to the law to recommend both applicants. And she said no, that's it's up to the panel. It wouldn't require amending the law at all. So since we had discussed that before and folks thought, including myself, that it would require an amendment, I don't see why it would.
That's fair,
So
but having wrote the law, it was the intent of the council and the committees who wrote it for there to be a selection of one.
Right.
I don't think
I'd be very curious to understand that that rationale, because I agree with Akeem that there is no identified process for merging any proposals that were submitted as part of the NOI process. The mandate to this review panel is very clear and it's very specific. You are to review the NOI, to review the proposals against the NOI and come up with a selection. And that selection, is 2 and 2 for each representative organization. So,
There's no parameters around our selection, except for that, to award it to a single. proposal it would take to N2, but there's no legal parameters around the recommendation or selection that we make as panelists.
But I'm sorry, but there
Right,
is a,
but it's
we are the select of the applicants, and there is no combined applicant.
right.
Yeah, but the district has done this before in reviewing RFPs. It happens that you get proposals typically, you know, when you are awarding a contract or a grant, but you know, it has happened before that you get proposals that have pros and cons on both sides, and you want to leverage both of those. This is not this isn't an unknown thing, or you know, and in this case where we're not awarding any money, again, I just don't see why it doesn't make the most sense for the district to leverage all the research skills that we have.
And maybe that happens at the time that the district negotiates the master services agreement, which is you know, the contractual agreement between the district and the entity selected, right? And so
I think the time is now, if rather than later, if you want to actually leverage both skill sets and ask from the district that to work together. And funding aside, but it would also make a much better funding pitch.
I think, but wouldn't that shift the burden of organization across the two applicants to the district? Like, I feel very strongly, like, it's essentially like this is going to be a lot of work to manage one. To have to manage two would be significant. But if it's a priority to this group, I think Urban was very firm in their commitment that they will engage other applicants. Whereas I felt like GW's commitment was like, yeah, we put it in here because I felt like we had to. It was more like, you know, we'll look into it. Where I think Urban's commitment was firm. But I do have concerns about awarding two, because I think that shifts the burden of management to us or to whoever.
Hold on just 1 second. So I think procedurally, I think how this would go is, I mean, at this time, there is no merged application. That is at this time, there is no more, and that's not what you're arguing. You're arguing that there should be some manner in which that they could come together and merge. Okay, so set that aside. What it is incumbent upon the selection committee to do is to vote on the applications as they are. The question is whether you are prepared to do that or not. The statute outlines a threshold requirement of what constitutes awarding the RPP. What you should do that first. That would be, so if it sounds like right now no one has the threshold requirement. So what you could do then, I think, is like we would have to figure that out in some capacity. Would it be, hey, there's nobody, do we open up? I don't want to do this. This is just like, you open up the NOI process again, a merged application comes back, maybe somebody else on the market comes back, and like you open up the process again. That could be one way to do it, and then you go through this process again. I think that we would have to like explore those different options of how to do that. But like I agree with Jen. It's that we were facilitating the conversation, like facilitating the applicants to come together should be on the applicants themselves, not on us to oversee, because you're not going to be able to select either one of them. So I think it would be some sort of process where we would NOI this again and then have them come back, and then if they choose to put together a combined application or not, and then maybe someone else joins or not. I think that would be your option there.
I mean, I think it's incumbent upon the on our panel to pick the strongest application, not to form the strongest application. And ultimately, perhaps, Erin, you're correct in that they would work better together, but it's not incumbent on us to create the strongest application. We have to weigh what was presented to us.
Yeah, I can see both sides. I am aware of instances in which this has been done before. So you know, typically you would, ask folks to work together and present a new application, which is, I would argue, is probably shorter than going through the whole NOI process again, and also, represents a way to move forward for the district if given the parameters of the legislation and and the voting requirements. But anyway, it's not unheard of to ask to get proposals, again, typically from contractors, and ask them to work together. This is not something, it's something that happened when I was at the Department of Ed, and it's something that has happened in local government, not at ODCA. We don't have that many contracts. It's something that has happened before and is the purview of, the folks reviewing the applications, which is usually not a panel such as this one, usually within an agency. But it's not I think it sounds abnormal given the legislative process, but is not a completely strange thing.
Erin, my suggestion is, I hear you, and I hear that there are benefits to it, and I'm sure you've had experiences like this. I do think we are tasked with selecting the point, and I think it's going to ultimately result in there be blending of the researchers themselves. So I think we are going to end up getting something very similar to what you're suggesting. Irvin has already clearly stated, and I believe Elizabeth on GW also said they're looking forward to reaching out to other researchers, whether it be the other applicant or other researchers that may come forward. So I think we're going to get what you want anyhow. It very much worries me for us to come back and say, now we want you to somehow figure out how to blend the points. And I feel like that signals really being protracted and slowing down. I think we're going to ultimately get what we want of having really robust research. And so I suggest that we have to somehow come to an agreement on the two applications, and then it will organically, we'll get to where we're hoping that we'll get to.
Also, I want to be clear and just sort of like as a translator to this process is that there is a difference between someone being awarded and then inviting the other party in, because with being selected, you get to sort of dictate some of the terms to that. That does not seem like it's going to be possible. You're not going to be able to say party A awarded it, now invite party B and figure out the terms to that. What potentially is going to happen is neither party A nor party B are selected, and both of them are neutral to each other, and then they can come and they have to facilitate it with no, it's not like we awarded one and you're saying, now you come play with us. You're telling them both on equal footing to go back and potentially do it again. I'm not quite sure when you are asking the questions about would you be open to other people, I think that sort of assumed if I got it, I would invite other people. So let's just be clear. Like, I don't know if the merging of parties is even as much as a done deal. I don't think you should bank too much on that, because
I wasn't suggesting that. Correct.
No, I wasn't
Yeah.
saying you, but I just wanted to like give everybody like that there's a difference potentially.
But I won't belabor this point more than I already have. I know that I have. So I appreciate you thinking about it. I'm really thinking about getting the best of everything for the district and what makes sense, given we aren't giving them any money and what we can get out of this. But we can move to, if everyone else is okay, the other like substantive comments and questions. I had some questions about other points that other people made, if we want to move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was something worth bringing up, Erin. Like, it was something worth fighting for. So I don't fault you for that at all. I think it is based on the assumption that the product would be better if we merge those two leaderships. And like, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, right? Because I would imagine the people that they have picked to be part of their leadership are people that are used to gelling and working together. So it might actually be better if one is picked and then invites the other to support. But definitely worth talking about. So thank you.
Can I just go back to the funding question just quickly? So like it is okay for us, if I'm understanding Nagesh and Justin's response and Akeem, it is okay for us to award, to vote and award for an applicant that kind of has given their intent to seek additional funding. And that's just our decision. And whether that funding comes through or not in fiscal year, I guess it would be 2022 for it, that's kind of, it's not independent, but it's just a separate question for council to consider and the mayor to consider in the normal budget process. We're not kind of giving we're not obligating the district to give them money to fulfill the mission by awarding it to GW, I guess is the question that I'm asking, or if there's a, or yeah, that just to clarify like my understanding of it. And to Aaron's point, I totally think the in-kind donation is much more than the few $100,000 that GW is asking for, and the value of data and access as an asset is much more valuable than that. But from a purely procedural standpoint, I wanted to understand that that was okay.
That's our understanding as well.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Also, the council, like the mayor will likely deliver what's called colloquially a supplemental budget to the council, transmit at the same time as the FY22 budget on March 31st. So we will have an opportunity at that point to add money to the FY21 budget. So it isn't necessarily the case that they couldn't get funding until October 1st, 2022. And there's, I mean, not every contract is actually budgeted, so there's opportunity throughout the year to move money around to fund something that isn't already explicitly budgeted or do a reprogramming. So, you know, we're not creating the appropriations authority and not creating that legal authority, but there certainly is an opportunity to find money to fund a contract, even if it wasn't already funded explicitly in the FY21 budget. If that's something that we as a government decide is a priority.
Yeah, exactly. But it would go through the same normal procedures as anything that was passed, for instance, subject to appropriations, or anything else that would need to be agreed upon in the supplemental budget or the regular budget. It's just for, you know, the executive and the legislative and OCFO and their role to decide
right.
through the normal processes, irrespective of this panel.
Yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of things that aren't like explicitly budgeted. So if there's like a copy machine contract that has to be funded mid-year, there isn't like a line item. They don't have to come back to council to get approval necessarily for such a low level contract, low dollar amount contract. I think contracts have to be over $1 million to be approved, have to come to the council for approval.
Yeah,
but also my understanding is
helpful,
that it wasn't necessarily the council's legislative intent not to ever provide additional RPP funding, but we tend to fund startup projects on a one-time basis the first years with the, you know, that we could possibly choose to fund it in future years. But just having the nature of having one-time funding does not necessarily imply that it's a one-year commitment.
I think it's important to consider too, like what Aaron mentioned earlier, it's going to take internal horsepower to meet the needs of the RPP as well. And so is this additional external dollars they're asking for that would go to GW, or was it more like Aaron said, it's like they're saying that the district would need to commit to like the internal support needs that would then need to be for urban as well?
I guess I'm having a hard, just given the whole history of this whole debate, I'm having a hard time understanding why people would think that the district isn't interested in RPP, simply because like the district was trying to do an RPP before the council stepped in. and created this legislative process. Like the DME was in conversations about something of this nature even before the council got involved. And then the council got involved because there were questions about the independence of that being the case. And we created this elongated process to get here, but the council has legislated its intent to form an RPP, has gone and met with heads of RPPs across the country, has legislated that OSSI and DCPS turn over data to said RPP, and has created a panel to select the RPP. So I guess like if there is a concern that the district isn't serious about this, like that is, I find that hard to believe given the realities of the situation. And my dog feels the same way too.
Yeah, I you know, goodness, I was hired in September of 2018 to work on this. So I feel all of those steps and investment on the district side to making this happen very deeply. And I don't disagree with any of that. I think we can also acknowledge that this hasn't been a typical course of events for an RPP, and which is fine. You know, no judges, as my 8-year-old says. But the the perception outside of DC is a bit of confusion and wariness, and yeah, I think just caution that about what people really want. And that's, I don't think we should begrudge them for that. RPP folks love RPPs. You know, from funders that typically fund them to the people that work in them. So like they've been watching DC with bated breath. It's been like the conversation and, you know, in the NERP conferences for 2 years now. So I don't take it personally that they are like judging our desires. Do you know what I mean? They're trying to figure out heads or tails of the situation. And, you know, unless you're in it, that's hard to know.
Yeah, no, I guess I say that all of that to say that like this idea that DC doesn't have skin in the game because it's not financially contributing, like doesn't jive with the reality of what we've been doing for the last 2 years.
Yeah, we are always misunderstood, Akeem. It's perpetually misunderstood. I don't disagree with you. And a lot of when folks went to Chicago, they talked about, you know, in their mind the importance of not having government funding. But University of Chicago, like the financial investment that they have made over more than 20 years at this point. They have floated the consortium at multiple points in time. And most other RPPs don't have that. And many others do have government support, local or state. Anyway, I don't think it's a matter of judgment or one is better than the other. It just kind of the landscape of what RPPs look like.
So it is 1:03, and we've done rounds of conversation, and we've not taken a formal vote. There was a slide in the deck that gave some options about how to proceed. You could move to a vote today. You could go back to your scoring templates and rescore, and then we could recalibrate that data and have another conversation and vote. Those were the two options that I came up with. I think we should entertain options of how you want to proceed. It sounds as to me, based on the feedback that you all provided, that people are certain what their position is, but we haven't formally voted, and I think formal like having a formal vote is important to do. And then we will have to figure out next steps regarding what we will do. But if we voted and suddenly we came to some sort of resolution, then that person would be awarded the contract or to move forward into the master service group. If we didn't, we would say that the selection committee did not come to the statutory requirement of making a selection. And then I would imagine that there would have to be broader conversations about how we want to proceed, both between also with the council about how we want to do this. If that may mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an attorney here giving any legal advice, but it's like, does that mean that we would reshop the NOI broadly and see who came back and what came back? But we were asked to make a selection, and I think my recommendation to you is to proceed to make that selection, and then we'll have to figure out how to deal with next steps on applications. But I'll entertain questions.
I think because we still have 25 minutes left scheduled, I'm finding this discussion to be really fruitful if we could continue the discussion before having a vote, because I think a vote would sort of finalize the meeting.
Okay.
So
I'd support that as well. I mean, to my beginning point, like I would personally appreciate a chance to look back through, maybe not word for word, the totality of the materials, but to be able to look through that and before making a final vote. I know that we're on a time frame though, so that would be my preference. But I don't know, I understand we're on a time crunch too.
That's my preference too, because I still have a couple questions on other people's comments. So sorry, I jumped to you, Sam, before I agreed with what you guys just said.
So what I'm understanding is Susanna's suggesting we take the full amount of time, which makes a lot of sense to have discussion, and then Sam, we go back through the materials and rescore and send it back in.
That would rescore, or if we took the previously scheduled time on the 29th, I think, yeah. and knew that was when, I guess if people wanted to rescore and resubmit, I know the scores aren't binding, but then to have the aim of coming to a consensus on the 29th or trying to, whether that's through voting or what the mechanism is, that would be what I think would be most productive. But.
Can we go back to the discussing of the proposals? Okay, so I think I need to learn personally more about what the pre-certification response means in the QA/QC response, because I understand that moves several of us, and I don't have really an in-depth knowledge of what that actually means. But one point, so that's on me. But one thing. What was that?
I have a question about that too.
Okay, but one thing that I meant to say that I didn't was that one thing that really pushed me towards GW was their treatment of the advisory committee versus Urban. So I felt like Urban has such a large group of partners with 15 partners that they have to spend a lot of time building consensus within those partners, and they seem to focus more on that internal collaboration and then only bring in the advisory committee at the very beginning and at the very end of the process to sort of approve what they're already planning on doing and then helping with the distribution. And bringing in a practitioner to help guide like their communication during the process, but a practitioner could be a government official probably, and not necessarily the broad group of stakeholders that the advisory committee represents. Whereas I felt like in GW's proposal, they were looking to collaborate with the advisory committee at every stage and not sort of hand over their finished product to the advisory committee and say like, okay, well, now go forth and distribute it. So I felt like that level of collaboration was really swayed me towards GW, but I would really like to hear about more about why the urban proposal response is stronger in pre-certification and the QA/QC response.
Yeah, I was curious if Sam, I assume you'll talk about that more, but if you can, I am familiar with pre-registration, but I'm and appreciate that it is growing, you know, beyond causal studies, and thank God that makes sense. But for me, I guess I don't understand what you gain from that official process that wasn't already codified in all of, you know, in all the analytic plans that you cement with the advisory committee. Like if all of that is not transparent and collaboratively decided on, then you're doing the RPP wrong anyway. But yeah, so curious about the distinction there.
Sure. If folks want, I can say briefly, because this is something that I could talk for hours about. But so there isn't a defined, there isn't a set definition of what is pre-registration, pre-specification, pre-analysis plan, analysis plan. There, I would say, in my reading of the field of open science, so there's a lot of differences sometimes in the terms, which is why I wanted to ask GW what they meant by posting an analysis plan as opposed to pre-registering. But to take a step back, the idea behind all of these things is to remove a lot of the, or at least to be transparent about where a researcher has discretion in what they are looking at when they look at data. And we've talked a lot about how messy education data will be coming from a variety of LEAs. Some of it may be newly collected data. Some of it will be data that is changed over years, and it requires a lot of analytical decisions for it. And so when I think of, or at least how we in the lab at DC and with DC agency partners have practiced pre-analysis planning or open science, is to be as transparent as possible about the research questions that we are asking, the methods by which we are going to do it, and as much as possible being very detailed about what we will include in that. Because if you are talking about any sort of an outcome, I'll take a school attendance as as an example that we use often. You can very much change whether someone is chronically absent or not, or whether an LEA is producing students who are chronically absent or not, by how you choose to analytically apply the 80-20 rule for attendance across time, and based on the data that are there. And so what we found that the discipline of doing pre-analysis plans is to put all of that discussion up front with the agency partners to understand what is truly valuable on the ground, and doing that disciplined process before you've looked at the data as much as possible. When you look at the data, new things become available, you realize stuff you missed, you realize where you were way too specific than you should be, but it's a record of what we were trying to do at the outset. And what we found when we talk about with agencies is that discipline is incredibly important for the quality of the research, kind of even beyond the transparency factor of it. Is it surfaces questions that would otherwise be left up to the researcher or the specific analyst, and then you get into issues of interpretation and these sorts of things. And so in my mind, that's the value of approaching any activity in that way, whether it's descriptive or causal, and most of this stuff will be descriptive. And so that's why I think it's important, and that's why I was more satisfied with Urban's response noting that they noted our practices specifically in the response, which is certainly pandery. But I wouldn't, I also agree with those practices because that's why we do them. So but that's not to say too much, but that's kind of where I see the importance for an RPP and any research.
Suzanne, I kind of noticed something too that you were just mentioning about the independence versus collaboration. I think it's helpful to discuss it a little bit. It's interesting how we hear or interpret different things. I think when Urban was talking about the advisory committee, and I agree with you, there's work that they need to do in the front end on the 15 researchers and hiring their ED, right? Those are all sort of startups that they need to get started on, and their norms and all the rest of it within their internal group. I think in a 10-year span, I am less worried about that 6-month startup than I am, right, as if there was just a year contract or a 2-year contract. I think with the idea of the advisory group, the way I heard them talking about it is they're very much setting the research agenda and then being clued in on the findings, particularly at the end. And I believe it was Urban that talked about assigning a stakeholder partner, practitioner partner, I forget the phrase, practitioner partner. And it's interesting, I didn't interpret that actually as a district agency person. It could be, I suppose. It depends on the project. And I'm guessing, again, because this is, to Erin's point, supposed to be very practice-oriented and practitioner focused, that it would be a school leader, right? They want the folks that are on the ground that are doing these sort of things that can then, stuff can be run by them continually. The advisory group is going to play a very important role of both setting the agenda, the stage, and understanding how things are progressing. But they're not going to have not the 20-some folks aren't going to have those boots on the ground sort of perspective that the actual practitioner would have. So that's just, for me, that's how I think about it and make the differentiation. I also think the independence part, I believe this is too, I think it was Akeem that brought it up. This has been a long series in the making. Now I'm going to get the timing quite wrong, right? But to Erin pointed out, she was hired in 2018, which originally the auditor was thinking about doing this RPP per council, right? And then the executive started moving forward with some conversations, and that's when council and the executive stepped together and said, okay, let's do one where it's across both. So I think part of that independence conversation is this sort of oscillating back and forth between the two separate parties. And and perhaps it's because I have been sitting in the seat for a little while, part of that interpretation is their point is we're not going to receive dollars from either entity. We are going to move forward with research and RPP to help schools. So that's just my perspective on their interpretation.
One question I didn't get to ask, I asked about the data and how they would prepare it and share it and what that would look like. And again, still have the same concerns there. Although I agree with what you said, Jen, that they weren't going to like totally clean everything and and hand it over in that way. But a follow-up question that I didn't get to ask was about the research projects that were presented, and if and how they would be different had they been part of an RPP. And I think it's interesting that they were presented in this capacity, because I don't think that they meet the same criteria that Urban talked about in terms of transparency and rigor and independence. So I don't know if this conversation, I don't know how in the weeds we want to get on research methods and what's presented in a report to stakeholders versus practitioner partners. And what does it mean to make a recommendation or to jump to a conclusion that's not founded in the data? So I'm very willing to go there because this is what I think about all day, every day anyway. But I did not find that in particular, that the Empower K-12 project presented met those bars. And I also think we should think about for both applicants, broadly, if and what does it mean for independence and conflict, if, for example, you have contracts with LEAs to do that type of work. If and how, as Sam, I think, asked a really good question of Josh, which is, and I'm gonna get it wrong, but if and how would your own body of work change, once, if awarded the RPP? And he said, oh, I think it would all just, feel free, Sam, to correct how I'm rephrasing your question.
Oh, I think it was someone else's question, actually.
Oh,
so
sorry, my bad.
Yeah, that was
for a good
that was
question. That
was yours. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you, Akeem. It was a good question. I appreciated it. And he said he feels like it would really be a net gain to all of his work, and things would, you just gain more insight and information, which makes a lot of sense. However, it doesn't address the inherent conflict and tension in having specific LEAs as clients. So
I'm sorry, can you just, this is a big point. I'm a little confused. The LEAs are going to be specific clients in the RPP, presumably. There is going to be more than one, most likely, so that we have a more representative idea. But it is school-based, so I'm confused.
I'm talking about Empower K-12's business model. So if and how does that business model conflict with independent RPP work? And I think that's a question we should consider for all of the folks that applied. I don't want to uniquely single out Empower K-12.
So can I just rephrase real quick? So what you're saying is, because our Empower K-12 has contracts with particular LEAs or different entities, right, who may be funding the project. So pick another foundation or something, right? A lot of them are, I believe, foundation driven. So if they are receiving contracts, you're concerned that they won't be independent if they're involved in RPP because they could be swayed by the funding that they're receiving from someone else.
Right, it's pretty basic definition of conflict.
So GW then, in this case, or Mathematica or anyone else, should also not receive any separate funding from the district or LEAs to do their research.
Well, no, that's a good question. I think one, there's a big difference in like your entire business model being based on specific contracts with specific LEAs versus, an organization like AIR that is their funding is intentionally very diverse and spread across. So, they really strategically spread out their funding sources so that they're not, tied in any one place or direction. So that it's just different. These are very different business models that we're talking about. And yeah,
I guess like specifically to the point of Josh's organization, like a lot of these LEAs don't have back-end offices that are as robust as DCPS's like data analysis team.
Yeah.
I know this
it's
because
business
I
model.
was on DCPS's data analysis team.
Yeah.
And so it's what they're doing is, hey, here's our data.
Yep.
Tell us what this data means.
Yeah, I know.
Which is essentially what we're asking the RPP to do. So I don't understand how
I mean, the
that's a
financial
conflict.
incentive is the difference. That is, you know, I can go and get the DC's code around conflict, but that's the difference.
You're able to have different contracts with different entities. I guess I think I understand the point you're trying to make. I apologize for jumping in. I know we're running out of time, and I wanted to make sure what we're getting, because this is pretty big. Your concern of conflict of interest with an entity because they receive funding from the LEAs. I mean, I think, again, they are not the prime, or in this case, they are not the main point, right? So urban is the main point, right?
What's, sorry? I couldn't,
So
sorry.
Empower K-12 is not the point, right? Urban, it plays quarterback. I'm just using that phrase.
Yes, no, I agree. I think that's correct.
And so there are supposed to be measures that are put into place. I mean, I think that is an interesting point. I think, again, the mission of that organization, as I understand it, is to help support the schools in making data-driven decisions, right? That's what they have been doing for a while. So to then give them answers, again, for most of the work that they've been doing is internal to the LEA to support them. I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure I'm as convinced of the conflict of interest. I think it's interesting, but I don't know if I'm as swayed as.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wish I had gotten a chance to ask that question because, you know, because of that particular, there are examples in that particular project that wouldn't typically fly as RPP work. So I'm curious if and how Urban's, all the standards and processes and protocols that they outlined, how do they see that as changing the product and recommendations? And the transparency, you know, if you go and look like buried deep in the appendix, you'll see what the full sample looks like and how you kind of have to figure out yourself how that changes things. Yeah. But yeah, it doesn't look yet like transparent, rigorous work like what Urban described.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. I think that's an interesting point. And I also think it's interesting, right, of this sort of tendency. So I know what you're talking about in the appendice. It talks about the sample that they actually use for the analysis, I think, for 3rd through 8th grade in their sample. And it goes down quite a bit because of the testing irregularities, right, that has happened in the fall because kids are at home. I think that is interesting. And it's actually something, as we've dug into it, I think that is a very important fact that some of the kids that may have been the worst off may not be represented, right? So this might be a little bit of a glowy set of findings, which is even more concerning with so many months of decline.
It looks better. There's less loss if you have those.
Right. I think it might be even worse. I think that's fair. So I think that's an interesting thing. I think there's also a tension of making sure that there is examples of work that is supporting and foundational for data-driven. I have to say, when I asked Elizabeth for some examples, she gave, you know, Jennifer from Howard University gave an example of some work she's doing. I'm not sure which LEA she's supporting, but I didn't feel like that answer was, I could have used a little more. I know that Dr. Foyer talked about the work that they did for the Academy back in 2013, 2014, but it's been a while. Oh, so I do think it's an interesting.
Yeah. I really wish he hadn't talked so long.
That was the time rules were not always abided by. The two things I just wanted to add on that is, I think Aaron raises a good point about any of these entities like that, and that none of them can be considered completely independent from the district if they receive some sort of contracting from them. for any of the from the district, regardless of the diversity of their portfolio. And I think that underscores the importance of having rigorous and transparent pre-registration of some sort, because the issue, it doesn't solve anything, but what it doesn't solve everything, but what it does is say what we intended to do at the beginning. So the example of incomplete or missing data in the testing, in like some of the testing analyses, like you want to have a record up front to say, did you think of that? And if so, how are you planning to deal with it? So that we can look, so that the advisory committee and anyone else in the public can say, well, you said this, but you did something different. Did you acknowledge that and explain why? Or did you kind of just wave your hands at it? And I think that it doesn't solve everything, but I think it enforces, like, that is why I believe it's important in this scenario. It is a small portion of what we're trying to do, but I think it's an illustrative example, because we in the lab exist as part of the mayor's office. You could raise any number of concerns about the independence of our analysis due to that fact. And we believe that being transparent and open about it is an important check upon that. And I think the same would apply to any possible conflict of interest between the RPP recipient, their kind of components, and anyone else involved.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, I think it was a really worthwhile study to do. I just one, I don't feel that transparency was up to par, and two, I don't feel that the data was strong enough or compelling enough for the headlines. And they talked a lot about we're know the difference between making recommendations and presenting what's available. But if you look at differences in subgroups, for some strange reason, like this data this year, as you guys know, is wild. It's nothing makes sense anymore. And so like kids with IEPs actually gained. Every subgroups were really different. There was a lot of variation. I'm really glad it's out there. But again, it just doesn't look like what I see typically presented to practitioners, SEAs, LEAs, schools, teachers as, neutral, here's what the data shows, without, jumping to recommendations and conclusions that are perhaps not warranted.
I would say that the notice of invitation itself asked for the applicant's knowledge and experience work partnering with urban school districts and partnering with government, and that's part of our scoring rubric. So you might have, and there might be issues. I'm not that familiar with Empower DC's work with Empower DC's potential conflict of interest, but because the notice of invitation set that up as an asset, having that prior experience, to ding applicants for having prior contracts with the district or concurrent contracts is in conflict with what the notice of invitation requested.
Yeah, although I would say, like, the work that Jennifer talked about is grant funded, for example. It's so anyway, it's a difference worth considering. I recognize that everybody here has contracts with the district.
And to your point, we do want to.
Everybody.
We want that, right.
Most of them are with the district more broadly, rather than specific LEAs. And if they are with specific LEAs, they tend to be grant funded and not client-based type of relationship. So.
All right. Thank you for bringing that up. I do think it's an interesting point that you bring up. I do also want to make sure that we are clear. I would hate for this one study to then sway an entire body of work from 15 different organizations. So I am just going to name that right now. I do think Empower K-12 work is incredibly helpful, right? It is probably some of the most timely work of trying to get out of what learning loss is across multiple LEAs. So, but I hear you on making sure that the standards of transparency, and to Sam's point, all the protocols are put into place so that we understand what we're getting, because that is going to be critical regardless who gets the master services agreement.
Okay, I hate to beat a dead horse with this, but I'm going to. It's 1:30. I don't know when we're going to get shut out of GoToWebinar, but I do imagine that people had other obligations for the rest of the day. It sounds like we are not prepared to have a formal vote today, and the next step is to rescore your rubrics, which you have. I don't think there's any need for me to send those back out to you, since you should still have them in your own files. But if that's something you need me to do, Akeem, or somebody, I can do that. Just tell me on a one-off basis. I'll just have to go back through my records.
I was going to ask if we can quickly just go around and say where we're leaning. Or has that changed since has anyone changed their mind since our initial 5-minute per person discussion?
I would say that I came in pretty strong, that I initially was very strong for Urban, then I came into this meeting very strong for GW, and this conversation has given me a lot to think about, so I feel like I'm more on the fence than I was when I came in. I'm not prepared to vote today. I want to rescore my rubric.
Fair.
So our meeting is scheduled for the 29th at 10:30. I'm going to ask if you could get me your rescored rubrics by 4 p.m. on the Monday prior. So if you could get me those on the 28th by 4 p.m., that will give me the opportunity to create the same tables again as we did the last time. And then I think that we will do our next meeting very similar to this. I'll provide you with the data, give you the opportunity to go around in the circle of the group for a limited amount of time, and then you can have conversation, and we'll decide if we're going to get to a vote then. And then we also have held the day following too. So
can I propose that we go into a closed executive session for the next meeting?
I'll need to check with Nagesh about that, but I will raise that with Nagesh. Nagesh had another obligation that he had to get to, and I will get you a response back to that. All right, everyone have a very nice holiday, and I hope you don't, I know that you're really into all this stuff, but I hope you don't spend too much time with it over your holiday season. It's good to see you all. All right, have a good day.
Good conversation, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.